On behalf of Western Michigan University, the College of Aviation, it is indeed an honor and a pleasure here today to have the Tuskegee Airmen. It is rare that we will get an opportunity to meet some individuals who have played a significant role in the part of African American history and the contributions that they have made not only to the Air Force and military, but also aviation in general. I would also like to thank the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, who is supporting this project. The Department of Africana Studies, Dr. Ben Wilson, has spent some time this morning talking and getting information. And this is really special, and it's dear to my heart as well, because I had a chance to shake the hand of people that changed the world, changed the way we think. And we're indeed an honor and a pleasure to have them here. I would also like to ask, before we get started, all of the veterans, could you please stand up so we can acknowledge you, please? All of the armed services, active duty, inactive, retired. Thank you for coming out. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dan Litinsky, Interim President of Western Michigan University. Brigadier General Litinsky.
Thank you. I'm Dan Litinsky, and I'd like to welcome you all to our events today and through tomorrow. As many of you know, I spent over 30 years on active duty as a regular Army officer, and during that time I had the privilege of serving with many fine women and men of all races, creeds, and national origin. Many of those are my close friends even to this day. In 1948, President Harry Truman enacted Executive Order number 9981, directing the equality of treatment and opportunity in all of the U.S. Armed Forces. This in turn led to the end of racial segregation in the U.S. Armed Forces. This was also a major step toward racial integration in the United States. Now, the Armed Forces have in many ways been an example of successful diversity at work, but it has not always been that way. Today, we have the honor and the privilege of hearing three gentlemen who helped change the course of military and flight history in this nation. With determination, perseverance, and grace in the face of daunting social obstacles, these gentlemen stood by their principles, and today we are all better for it. Major General Lucius Theus, Lieutenant Colonel Lee Archer, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Jefferson are Tuskegee Airmen, members for life of a unique brotherhood of World War II pilots who showed their courage against the Nazis and against entrenched discrimination at home. These officers and airmen were trained at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama after the U.S., at that time Army Air Corps, later Air Force, strict policies on racial segregation prompted a lawsuit by African American who was refused pilot training because of his race. An elite group of close to 1,000 African American pilots were trained for World War II's European theater, and many others were trained in support missions at the same time. They went on to become one of the Allies' strongest weapons against the Nazis. After the war, they went on to achieve great aviation and military success. Three, including General Theus, went on to serve as general officers. Gentlemen, I salute you. Let me tell you a little bit about our guests. Major General Theus retired from the Air Force in 1979 as Director of Accounting and Finance. His 36-year Air Force career was dedicated to upgrading military administrative operations, improving human and race relations in the armed forces, and encouraging young people to pursue careers in aviation. Theus was the first African American support officer and only the third overall to be appointed a general in the United States Air Force. He was also the first African American to attend the Harvard Business School's Advanced Management Program. He is a recipient of the Distinguished Service Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, the Legion of Merit, and the Bronze Star. Major General Theus Auditorium at Patrick Air Force Base was dedicated in his honor in 1996. He is currently a Chief Operating Officer of the Wellness Group based in Southfield, Michigan, and President of the U.S. Associates and Management Consulting Group. Lieutenant Colonel Archer flew 169 combat missions and was the U.S. Air Force's first black pilot to earn the coveted ACE designation by downing 5 enemy planes. His military career spanned nearly 3 decades of service, led to citations from Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, and from the Air Force Chief of Staff and the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Decorated with the Distinguished Flying Cross, Archer retired as a lieutenant colonel after 29 years of service, now resides in New Rochelle, New York. In speaking with him this morning, I also found out he commanded Stewart Air Force Base, where I happened to live for about 4 years, in New York, which I did not realize. Following the war, he was assigned to Tuskegee Army Airfield as chief of the Instrument Instructor School, held numerous post-war positions, including Chief of Protocol for the French Liaison Office, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers, Europe, the White House Air Force France Project Officer, and Chief and Executive Officer of 3 international military organizations. In civilian life, he taught at New York University, the Universities of Maryland and Florida, served as Corporate Vice President for Urban Affairs at General Foods, Chief Executive Officer of North Street Capital, and Chairman of the Hudson Commercial Corporation. Lieutenant Colonel Jefferson, a Detroit native, retired from the Air Force in 1969. A 1942 graduate of Clark College, he earned his pilot's wings in '44, flew 18 long-range bomber escort missions before being shot down by ground fire while on a mission in France. Spent 9 months as a German prisoner of war before being liberated by General George Patton's Third Army. Following the war, he served as an instrument instructor at Tuskegee Airfield. Discharged from active duty in '47, remained active in the Air Force Reserves for the next 22 years. Decorated with the Air Medal, Air Force Achievement Medal, Prisoner of War Medal, and the Air Force Presidential Unit Citation. Following his discharge from active duty, went on to earn a master's degree from Wayne State University, enjoyed a 30-year career with the Detroit school system before retiring as a vice principal. It is an honor to have these 3 gentlemen with us today. I cannot think of a more appropriate time for them to visit. Their careers and life experiences dovetail with our university's goals and aspirations. Determination, the pursuit of excellence, a love of aviation, and a commitment to diversity are all evidenced here today. Together today, we can celebrate the Centennial Flight, a passion for tolerance, and a love of flying that has been a part of this university for more than 60 years. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to ask you to join with me in applauding our 3 guests today. I'd like at this time to ask Dr. Ben Wilson, the Chair of Africana Studies here at Western Michigan University, to the podium.
Thank you, Dr. Dan. First of all, I'd like to greet you this way, the double V. A long time ago, General Curtis LeMay commented that African Americans did not have the intellectual capability of using advanced military hardware during the Second World War era, specifically neither airplanes nor tanks. The 61st Tank Squadron, trained at Fort Polk and in the Tynan, Louisiana area, proved him wrong and showed that he suffered from a debilitating cancer of racism. He also spoke about the cowardly nature of black men, an old stereotype that was refuted by the Buffalo Soldiers of the 24th Infantry and the Red Ball Express of the Second World War years. The Tuskegee Airmen showed the world that Curtis LeMay was whacked. Even the white American Lieutenant Colonel Noel Parrish, base commander at Tuskegee from 1942 to 46, knew that the general had a loose screw. So too did Lemuel Curtis, Mac Ross, Benjamin O. Davis, who eventually became the first African-American general, and from the Tuskegee Airmen, other generals, General Theus, and the original Black Panther, Chappie James. Also, the Tuskegee Airmen, who have a Western Michigan connection, knew that Curtis LeMay had been bombed out. For example, Robert Claire Chandler of Allegan, Michigan. As a matter of fact, he spent 1 year here at Weston. We cannot forget Dwayne Roberts, who was also a mechanic for the Tuskegee Airmen and one of the founders of Western Michigan University's Lewis Walker Race Relations Institute. In addition, Kalamazoo has a connection with Al Simeon, who was also a Tuskegee Airman. In addition to Al Simeon, we're talking about Spanky Roberts, had a connection with Kalamazoo, Freddie Hutchinson, and naturally, Sammy Rayner had a Kalamazoo connection. Sammy was from Chicago. Lee Archer, we know what you did. As a matter of fact, I was sitting laughing with Mr. Archie. He said he got all these things, and I told him how bad he was. That means good for y'all who don't know. And he said he never got a dime. Not one dime did they pay him for all those things. Now, Lee Archer, Alexander Jefferson, and General Theus, and others who served in the 99th Pursuit Squadron, later the 332nd Fighter Group, later the 477th, 616th through 619th Bombardment Group, also trained at Selfridge Field in Mount Clemens. There we go, another Michigan connection. All proved that LeMay, as I mentioned before, was whacked. These gentlemen in front of us followed the tradition of those who were trailblazers. For example, the African-American pilot by the name of Eugene Ballard, originally from Columbus, Ohio, who fought for the French in Lafayette Escadrille during the First World War. This conspiracy of silence about the black experience during the Second World War will be brought to light by these three gentlemen. Now, I would be remiss, because this is March and it's Women's History Month, I would be remiss if I did not mention the African-American females who were pilots. For example, Jessie Coleman, Willa Brown, Janet Bragg. They were also aviators. Betty, maybe we can get the Women's Studies area to put one of those black women up on their display wall. Well, gentlemen, please bring us the word. Now, this is an academy, an institution of higher learning, and I'm certain your words of wisdom would enlighten some of those of us in here who are still in the dark. General Theus, your show.
Thank you very much, Howard. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Wilson, for that really tremendous introduction to for all of us. President, General Potemski, good morning to all of you, and to all of you distinguished guests here this morning, and particularly to you distinguished students who are here this morning. There's really nothing that we Tuskegee Airmen enjoy more than getting together with those individuals who are interested in achievements, contributions to our great nation, and particularly interested in aviation, either as pilots, air crew members, or support members. And while, of course, we have already been introduced, you know a lot about us now. At the risk of redundancy, as I go on this morning, I will say a few more words about each of us. So the team that you see here before you this morning, Tuskegee Airmen, consists of 2 combat pilots par excellence, who engaged in aerial combat with the Germans, the best that the German Luftwaffe, or German Air Corps, could throw at them, and they won. You will, of course, hear from them again in more detail about their experiences, but I think that it would be well for me to just identify them as individuals. Both of these gentlemen are modest people, so as they were being talked about by first our president and then next by Dr. Wilson, they didn't raise up their hands. They didn't stand to accept any kind of adulation. They simply sat there. And that's what it's all about. We're not interested in personal adulation, and as you can see from the behavior of these two gentlemen. But I'd like to make sure that you at least know them as individuals. First, and I will have him stand, Lieutenant Colonel retired Lee A. Archer, Jr. Stand up, Lee. Let them see you. Lee Archer, Jr. Five confirmed victories over German aircraft to his credit. He's a retired vice president of a major United States corporation and a very successful entrepreneur. And next, I want you to know, and I want him to stand, Lieutenant Colonel, Air Force retired, Alexander Jefferson. Stand up, Alex. As was mentioned earlier, while participating in combat against the Nazis, he was shot down and became a prisoner of war of the Germans. He later retired not too long ago from being a school principal in our public schools in Detroit. Did an outstanding job at that one. Now, you'll hear more about them a little later. And as for me, I think that you've heard perhaps enough about me, but you should know that I fit into that category of support persons. You see, for every one of the pilots that we had, some 950 combat pilots graduated from the program at Tuskegee Army Airfield. We needed anywhere from 10 to 15 other support people, because you see, this experiment, the Noble Experiment as this was called, required that we train and employ not only the pilots, but we had to have all of the support personnel who would be our folks. And I was just asked to define that word, our folks, a little earlier. I'm referring to African Americans, because we needed mechanics, we needed crew chiefs, we needed to have cooks and bakers, we needed truck drivers, and all of those people. So you're talking about another roughly 13,000 individuals who had to support these gallant Tuskegee Airmen pilots. And they too are entitled to be called by the title of Tuskegee Airmen. And so, as for myself then, my support role was as a first sergeant at a base deep in Mississippi, Biloxi, Mississippi, Keesler Field. When this program was announced, so many of our fine young African American men wanted to be a part of this program to fight against the common enemy, that they came from all over the United States. So many came that we needed to divert many of them first to that base in Biloxi, Mississippi, where then, as a first sergeant, I was able to give them basic military training before they went on to Tuskegee Army Airfield for their flight training. I was later commissioned and then went over to Tuskegee to join the group and continued my support work over there. Again, we're certainly happy to be here with you this morning to help to increase your knowledge and appreciation of what America has to offer all of its citizens, and how you can continue to make your own individual contributions to our great nation. And so hopefully then, our presentation this morning, covering this all too little known segment of American history, will help you to better understand and to better appreciate the basic freedoms which we enjoy in America today, to better understand and appreciate the inherent duties and responsibilities of all Americans, to better understand and appreciate the cost of our freedoms and the importance of our doing everything that we can to preserve our American way of life and our freedom. We Tuskegee Airmen remain inalterably committed to the basic principle of an American defense force strong enough to defend America, not only its territory, but to defend its interests and its allies anywhere in the world today, and that includes, of course, outer space. This is why my colleagues and I not only did what we could during the war, but we continue to contribute to the well-being of our nation by doing a lot of volunteer things, things that are not for pay, but because it gives us pleasure in supporting our nation towards the end of having a strong America. And so then, our order of presentation this morning will be first, I'll give a brief overview, outline of some of the background of the Tuskegee Airmen, how it came into being. Then we'll go on and look at an old Army training film, a film that is designed to give you a little better understanding of just what these Tuskegee Airmen did by way of training and their employment in combat. And then we will hear briefly from each of the other two individuals who are here with me this morning. And then we'll engage in a learning dialogue, if you will, because I feel that that's the best way for us to learn about one another, is to talk back and forth with one another. And hopefully then, our presentation will be enough to remind all of us of one of the great histories, great lessons of history, I should say, that African American men and women, even though deemed inferior by some, greatly handicapped by discrimination and segregation, were unsurpassed as they went about performing their historic deeds of contributing mightily to the defense of our great nation, which we love so much, and unequivocally demonstrating that they could and they would give their all, and they would literally rise to great heights in defense of freedom. This is indeed a story that we feel should be told and retold over and over again, because even today, there are just too many of our citizens in America who either did not know about the contributions of these African American pioneers and other African American pioneers, or they've just forgotten about it. It's particularly important for you who are students, because we know that most of you were not born, or you were too young to know about or to remember these contributions. You see, history tells us, study of history tells us, that Africans and African Americans started making their contributions many, many years ago, long before our country came into being. Africans, if we go back to the great kings and queens of old, if we look at many of the great generals all the way back to Hannibal, if we then think about the fact that beginning even before the Revolutionary War, we had Africans, African Americans, who with their half-pikes and tomahawks helped to defend our nation against those who would encroach on it. But you see, the history that we're going to talk about this morning really began with a person who was mentioned earlier, a gallant warrior by the name of Eugene Bullard. In World War I, he was so eager to join in and help to fight against the Germans. But because of his race, he was denied that opportunity. But he was not to be deterred. He joined the French Foreign Legion, learned to fly, and fought with the French against the Germans. As a matter of fact, I had the great honor, not too long ago, to receive from his nephew the many medals won by this gallant warrior on behalf of the Air Force Museum. And now, ladies and gentlemen, let's turn to the Tuskegee Airmen. Tuskegee Airmen. This is a name taken by these gallant warriors from the name of the base where they trained at Tuskegee, Alabama. Now, what I'll do for you this morning, I'll try to paint for you a picture of our society and our world at that time. You see, in the late 1930s, the early 1940s, as I look back to that period, I see at that time a nation, and I see indeed a world being swept up, if you will, in this rising fervor of powered flight, flight by private aircraft, flight by commercial aircraft, stunt, circus flight, military flight. I see also, as I look back, a world being drawn, if you will, irresistibly into World War II, a war in which it was quite obvious from the news coverage that we had that the airplane would play a very decisive role. I see this airplane as a terrifyingly effective weapon, particularly as these screaming German Stuka dive bombers softening up the Allied defense lines for the lightning thrusts of the German Panzer, or tank divisions, if you will. And like most of the young majority members in our society at that time, the African-American young men were very patriotic, and they wanted to join in the fight against our common enemy. But they wanted to join in not in labor battalions or in the traditional roles for African Americans, but they wanted to join in as combat pilots. Unfortunately, however, at that time, the state of our society did not include open access to this exhilarating world of flight by all of the citizens of our great nation. I remember also, one of the things that sparked my interest in aviation is that I grew up in this small town not far from Chicago. And because these African Americans who had acquired aircraft, some they built from kits, some they bought as used aircraft, but they taught themselves to fly. And they came out to a field, a cornfield, if you will, near this small town. They would land their aircraft there. They would encourage we young kids to come out and look at and even have the opportunity to stroke what then appeared to be very sleek looking machines. And for a few cents, or just because they wanted to help us, they would take us up and fly us around the area. I knew then that I was going to be and that I could be a leader in aviation. But in any case, looking back at that period, I see many highly qualified African Americans just itching for an opportunity to learn to fly so that they could fly in defense of, and if necessary, give their all to their nation, our nation, America. And so then, again, flashing back to Chicago, I see two pioneering aviators saying to themselves, these two young men, Dale White and Chauncey Spencer, saying to one another, we must at all cost demonstrate that we can fly and that we deserve an opportunity to fly and fight in defense of our nation. And so they scrounged money from wherever they could. They took their own meager resources and they rented an ancient Lincoln Page biplane and flew that aircraft from Chicago to Washington, D.C., simply to demonstrate that we could fly military aircraft. And if you listen very carefully, you will also hear then Senator Harry S. Truman saying to these young pioneers, if you guys had guts enough to fly that thing all the way from Chicago to Washington, I have guts enough to see that you get what you're asking for. And then visualize, if you will, in this environment that I've tried to paint for you, here at Tuskegee, Alabama, the wife of the then President of the United States of America, Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, voluntarily, against the wishes and advice of all of her retinue, if you will, of people who were escorting her, security people, voluntarily climbing into the back seat of an airplane flown by a fellow that we affectionately know as Chief Anderson, who had taught himself to fly, a black man, taking her up, flying around Tuskegee, landing, and when she got out of that aircraft, she turned to the crowd and she said, they seem to fly all right to me. And so then, ladies and gentlemen, with this kind of backing, the endorsement of the black press, the historically black college, Tuskegee Institute, the courts, yes, it took lawsuits to break down the barriers. The naysayers now concluded that it was time for the noble experiment. So on orders from the War Department, a base to train African Americans to fly military aircraft rose from these red clay farmlands of Alabama. And then to this program, as I mentioned earlier, came these young African American men and women, highly qualified and eager. They came from all over the United States of America. They came from the West, from the North, from the South, from the East. They came with only one goal in mind, and that was to be the very best combat pilots that the world had ever seen. And the support people who came to this base also had only one goal, and that was to be the very best support people, because they knew that in order to succeed, they had to be the very best. Now, I mentioned at the outset, many of them came to the base where I was a first sergeant, where I gave them basic military training. I gave them some of their psychological, psychomotive tests. And even though they were found fully qualified, they had to be held back at this base until the strict quota system would permit them to be shipped on to Tuskegee Army Airfield for flight training. But all knew that they had to be patient and they had to be the very best, because they knew that unless they were the very best, this experiment would fail. And it would prove to the naysayers, once and for all, the wisdom, quote, wisdom, unquote, of keeping blacks out of the cockpits of military aircraft. However, when these Tuskegee Airmen sought the opportunity to fly, they were fully qualified and they were ready. These Tuskegee Airmen were literally standing at the door of opportunity with their bags of knowledge and education, including many with even college degrees. So when this door just cracked a little bit, they were able then to push this door of opportunity wide open and step in and take full advantage of these newfound opportunities. Can't you just see them now at Tuskegee Army Airfield, working hard, training hard, establishing both individual and collective reputations for excellence? Can't you also see these proud support personnel, again, working hard alongside these embryo pilots, making sure that all of their requirements were satisfied? Dedicated personnel dispensing the best medical service, the best food service that they could, and the mechanics, making sure that the engines purred with efficiency and reliability, until they knew and had demonstrated their competence. All of these individuals working toward this one goal of making sure that this experiment would succeed. Now, it took leadership, and many leaders emerged. You see a couple of them sitting here with you. And then right in the middle of all of this activity, I can see then Colonel Noel Parrish, a white man, working hard to provide the very best training possible and walking a tightrope between the demands of fairness and those of the bigots. And then picture, if you will, with me, this ramrod straight first African American to graduate from West Point in the 20th century, who had never been spoken to other than in the line of duty for 4 years while he was at West Point, General Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., whom we just lost not too long ago, taking charge and honing these already well-trained and dedicated young men into a razor-sharp fighting unit which would deploy first to North Africa and then on to Europe to write page after page of glorious combat in the history of our nation at that time. And these historical pages are recorded deeds that were considered improbable, if not impossible, such as sinking a German destroyer with only machine gun fire, shooting down German jet aircraft with their propeller-driven aircraft. One of our mutual friends, Roscoe Brown, having been on a mission, saw a German aircraft climbing to challenge them. In fact, because they did not have propellers, they looked strange, but this didn't deter them. Roscoe Brown and his wingman engaged those German fighters, shot down 3 of them, thus becoming the first Americans to shoot down German jet aircraft with their propeller-driven aircraft. And finally, the record that is clearly recorded of not losing an American bomber which they were escorting to enemy aircraft gunfire. Now, such achievements were not without the payment of a high price by these Tuskegee Airmen. The names of a number of these gallant warriors who did not return home are inscribed on a marble plaque in the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Museum in Fort Wayne, Detroit, Michigan, because they gave their last true measure of strength and life defending those bombers and our freedoms also. Some of them were wounded, others were shot down and taken prisoners, such as Alex Jefferson and 32 of his comrades. And I can also picture, and you can too if you try hard enough, these proud men sticking out their chests to have pinned on them the countless medals earned under fire for their prowess, for their dedication, for their excellence. They were awarded the Presidential Distinguished Unit Citation, 744 Air Medals, 94 Distinguished Flying Crosses, the Legion of Merit, and a Silver Star. But throughout this whole experience, these dedicated, patriotic, loyal citizens achieved because they pursued excellence in all that they did. They overcame the disadvantages, if you will, of discrimination and segregation, and they proved to the world that in defense of our nation, their nation, that they could and they would fly and fight along with the very best. And now then, I see the end of the wars coming into view. First, this victory in Europe that was hastened by these gallant warriors. Shortly thereafter, and before this fully combat-ready 477th Bomber Group could be deployed, the atomic bomb put the end of hostilities in the Pacific. The Tuskegee Airmen, having then contributed greatly to their victory over the would-be dictators of the world, continued their fight for freedom and equal opportunity for all of the citizens of our great nation. Some remained in the service and became technical sergeants, masters, seniors, chiefs, colonels, lieutenant colonels, captains, majors, all of the ranks, right on up the line. And as you know, 3 of us became generals. Others left the service and became successful business, government, professional people, such as the former mayor of Detroit, former lieutenant governor of Colorado, borough president of Manhattan, school teachers, principals such as, again, Alex Jefferson, vice presidents of major corporations such as Lee Archer, successful entrepreneurs such as Lee Archer. And of course, there's no doubt that the illustrious performance of these pioneering Tuskegee Airmen certainly contributed greatly to the opening of the doors to a fully integrated armed forces, fighting very effectively in Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, the Balkans, and now in the war against terrorism in Afghanistan and elsewhere. In fact, because of the illustrious performance of the 332nd Fighter Group, which was the organization, the banner under which we fought, because of its illustrious performance, that unit, which was deactivated at the end of the war, was reactivated not too long ago as the 332nd Air Expeditionary Group. And when I had the opportunity to visit with that group in Kuwait last year, I found this group now staffed by a myriad of people of all races, creeds, religions, and so, performing gallantly and keeping the legend of the Tuskegee Airmen alive in that torn part of the world. So we must look upon the achievements of these Tuskegee Airmen and all of our African American pioneers as reflecting well not only on them, but more importantly, as a constant reminder to all of you and all of the others who encounter this saga, if you will, of courage, patriotism, dedication, that regardless of how downtrodden a people may be, that if given an opportunity, they will work hard and they'll effectively contribute to the defense of freedom, even though not fully sharing in that freedom at that time, but a freedom for all of the our American brothers and sisters, a freedom for the millions of people throughout the world suffering under the yoke of tyranny, a freedom envisioned by the framers of our Constitution, and a freedom envisioned by our forefathers as they fought and died under the Star-Spangled Banner here in America and the far-flung corners of the world. And so now, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening to that brief overview of the Tuskegee Airmen. What I'd like to do now is to turn briefly to an old World War II film that's designed to further broaden your knowledge of the contributions of African Americans to the building and preservation of our American freedoms. So may I have the film at this time?
But it's 3 Nazis spinning down in blood and flame to every one of ours. Routine morning patrol. They're good planes, wonderful planes. And the pilots are good too. Listen.
Yesterday, I fulfilled one of my ambitions as a combat pilot. I got one airplane.
An American far from home, fighting a war around the world. Listen again.
This was my leader and the second ship was me, and 2 corporals came on my right. I turned right and put up a stone wall of bullets, and the first
A wall of bullets. It wasn't so long ago these men were students in a university, workmen in a shipyard, just plain citizens from everywhere USA. They changed jobs, they changed clothes. They took a train into the future. They didn't know what the future would be, but many hoped they'd get the chance to fly and fight in the air. Some wanted that chance more than anything in the world. Deep inside Alabama is a famous school called the Tuskegee Institute. It was founded on July 4th of 1881. And since that Independence Day, it has graduated many thousands into agriculture, into science, into industry. This school was the first of its kind, and its founder, Booker T. Washington, was a pioneer who broke open a road for others to follow. This man had a dream, and the dream became stone. He lifted the veil of ignorance from his people and pointed the way to progress through education and industry. Close to this school, close to the work this man had done, the United States government determined to build an airfield. 3 years ago, this was just another farm in Alabama. More than trees had to be cleared away. There was misunderstanding and distrust and prejudice to be cleared away. 3 years ago, there was only an idea. But ideas are powerful things. And today, there are fighter planes flying overhead. Instead of swamp and yellow pine, there are hangars, repair shops, barracks. Instead of patches of corn, concrete flight strips. But that's not enough. You can't make a fighter squadron out of concrete and aluminum and a can of paint. It takes men. A chemistry student, a welder, a shoe salesman must learn how to fly. A group of average Americans must become a team of fighting men with wings. There's a new world up here. A man has to learn his way around. It takes many weeks of learning to make a fighter pilot. And a lot of that learning is done in a hard wooden chair. Because a fighter pilot is a combination of a mathematician and an athlete, a scientist and a sharpshooter. He's got to know what goes on inside his plane. The heart of his fighter is steel and copper. Its bloodstream is gas and oil. But its brain is the man who flies it. He begins in a safe, slow plane, 2 wings instead of 1. But he flies many hours inside a closed room. In the morning, he he may be flying a prescribed course over a sheet of paper. In the afternoon, he may fly the same course above the clouds. He trains his muscles down here very close to the ground, but he'll use the same sense of balance and coordination in the skies above Tuskegee. For this job of flying is never easy, and sometimes it's very, very tough. But he's learning how high and how fast and how far he must go to reach the enemy. Pilotage, dead reckoning, theory of flight, radio code. Yes, he's getting muscles in his mind. He's getting hard, keen, quick. He's coming into the clear. Here above the warm, familiar hills of Alabama, these Americans are learning to fly in those tight combat formations they'll use someday to hunt down the German and Jap above his own cities. In addition to fighter groups, a year ago this field began to train men for medium bombers. And that too was a pioneer step. But one thing it proved: you can't judge a man here by the color of his eyes or the shape of his nose. On the flight strip, you judge a man by the way he flies. Here's the answer to Adolf and Hirohito. Here's the answer to the propaganda of the Japs and Nazis. Here's the answer: wings for this man. Here's the answer: wings for these Americans. Squadron after squadron out of Tuskegee, flying P-40s first, tough little planes, then striking with Thunderbolts, P-47s, then riding the Mustangs, P-51s. No, it was never easy for these men. They were pioneers, and no pioneer has it easy. They fought lies, they fought heartbreak, and they won. Now they fight the enemy on his own soil. They fought the enemy, not without loss. Out of the first class to graduate almost 3 years ago, only a handful are left alive, so that liberty might not perish from the earth. 3 years have passed since the founding of Tuskegee Airfield. 750 pilots have been trained. 50% of them have been in combat. And this is only a beginning. Listen to Major General Butler at the celebration of this 3rd anniversary.
Here, for the first time, Negro aviation cadets were being groomed to fly warplanes of a unit which was then a unit in Fort Owen, the 99th Pursuit Squadron. These men were pioneers of a venture so new that you who stand here before me now, after 3 years, may still be considered forerunners in the movement which has given you a place in the fighting men of the sky.
Under the feet of these men, a new road is being beaten out. Broad enough now for thousands and 10,000s. A good road for our country. These men remember that, marching or flying. They remember backing them up, their families, their friends, who expect so much of them. And backing them up, the men and women of every creed and speech and color who made these planes. And backing them up, the most powerful force in the world, the strength of the American people.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, let's hear from Colonel Archer. Will give us a brief overview of his experiences, and then that'll be followed by Colonel Jefferson, who will do the same, and then we'll engage in a dialogue with one another.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think that I ought to prepare you for a different kind of approach. This has been a rather serious conversation, and if you ever get a bunch of Tuskegee Airmen together, old-timers, and you hear us talk, It's never about there I was at 30,000 feet with a Focke-Wulf on my gun, there's things like that. No, we talk about what made us and how we were trained and where we came from and where we went. And truthfully, we end up like a bunch of silly little people. We giggle and laugh about the darn thing because some of the things were so serious and so ridiculous that if you didn't laugh about them, it'd drive you nuts. I mean it. So, incidentally, you won't be surprised to find out that whenever anyone's called to make a speech or a presentation somewhere, that if they're worthwhile, they prepare for it. And I thought I was going to come and talk to a bunch of young students. And I'm very pleased to see that not only are the students here, but there's very mature people here who can understand it. I'm a fighter pilot. I was for 30 years, flew airplanes by myself, and fighter pilots are notorious for their modesty and how they go. And in fact, you'll find out if you watch movies and things like that, that most of them tell you about fighter pilots and not the other people who fought wars. And if you remember an old movie, they had a song in it, As Time Goes By. And the words to the song, during the war, we used to change the words to all the songs. Only a few I can repeat here in a mixed crowd. But one of them was, As Time Goes By. And you know the words to it. It must remember this. A kiss is still a kiss. A sigh is just a sigh. We changed the words amongst the fighter pilots into, you must remember this. Those guns won't always miss. Somebody's going to die. And we went through the song, and on the end it says, the key to the story is, it's still the same old story. Fighter pilots get the glory, and bomber and other pilots die. And that's the story. So you hear from us on that. It's the propaganda for fighter pilots. What they do is interesting. If you like being shot at, it's interesting. But there are other things about it also. And you just saw a propaganda film. And I don't know if any of you noticed the voice on it. The voice was Ronald Reagan. That was the time when he was telling you things about the Tuskegee Airmen, well, as we would like people to have thought they were, but they weren't. He was also the biggest seller of cigarettes on the face of the earth for a company called Philip Morris, which I know all about. I was an officer of Philip Morris Corporation. When you're preparing for a speech, you usually write a speech out for whom you're going to talk to. And I brought these in, and I didn't hide them. This is a speech I make for elderly people. This is a speech I make for young people. I make it at the Air Force Academy. And I don't intend to use them. I brought them in to scare you. I'm going to do, for a few minutes allowed me, what is called anecdotal history. You know all about the Tuskegee Airmen already, but I try to tell you little stories about what happened to us, why they happened, what happened, because you're old enough to be able to make the concession yourself. You're not here to sit and let me tell you what you should think. So we'll do that. I came to this conclusion after talking at the Air Force Academy once, and I told them, Tuskegee Airmen, why we were there, what we did, how we did it, and what happened to us after it was over. And when I finished, about 8 or 9 of the cadets says, well, yeah, but Colonel Archie didn't tell me this. So I realized I could talk for hours and still you wouldn't know what I was talking about, wouldn't answer your particular question. So I recommend to our host here and everyone else that we make this presentation and then we're open to questions. Nothing illegal. No question is barred, and you can do it. I must advise you also that sometimes you'll find that we're equal opportunity offenders. We'll say something you don't like sooner or later. And give my second advisory is that it is still illegal to form mobs in front of the theater to wreak revenge on someone who said something you don't like. It's even against the law still to ride people out of town on rails. Tuskegee Airmen was a program designed to change, to fail. Right. If it wasn't for Mrs. Roosevelt, we wouldn't have been in a business at all. And Mr. Roosevelt didn't give us the Tuskegee experiment because he was in love with us. Franklin D. Roosevelt was running for a third term. First time a president in American history had violated the unwritten law that started by George Washington, who said after 2 terms, a president ought to resign. He ought to stop running. Roosevelt wanted to be a third-term president. He wanted to be a 4th term. And if you knew Mr. Roosevelt, he wanted to be 5th, 6th, 7th. He'd be president still if he had his way. And his wife, Eleanor, was the one who told him that the black press in those days was 160 small black newspapers across the country telling people what they should do. And they had this double victory, VVV, which the general told you about. Victory against the Germans, victory against the racism in the country. Why I wanted to be a Tuskegee Airman, I'll never know, because my father was dead against it. I came from a family of 10 children. I'm 9 of 10. And in the old days, families like that, there were laws. And the first 2 laws that I remember as a young man was that, 1, I'm your father, not your friend. 2, I make the laws, you follow them. Under today's conditions, I kept my old man in jail forever. Child abuse. My father had served in what was known as the Old 15th. If you want to read about African Americans in the military, you'll hear about the Old 15th. It's now called the 369th. My dad went overseas and with the Old 15th reported to France, and the commanding general over there, one of our better known generals, says, no, I don't want them. And why? They're black. Or in those days they were colored. You can't keep a name for us for more than a couple of years. So their commanding officer, who was a wealthy white man from Boston, one of the Peabodys, he said, I didn't come over here just to be a service battalion individual. And he went to the French and said, will you take us? And the French said yes. And my dad and the whole 15th fought in the World War I for the whole war with the French. The whole organization received the Croix de Guerre. Outstanding. And they got American uniforms when they were coming back home to the States. And the Americans wanted them to parade up and down 7th Avenue in Harlem and downtown New York. So his idea was that, okay, buddy, I'm buddy, we paid our debt, and I got nothing for it, so his suggestion was go to Canada and I'll send you a check each month. But I was a young student, and I loved this country. I loved what it was to me, and I didn't love all the people in it. But I thought I ought to do something to defend it. because I had this idea when I was a young man that even though I was hearing about what was happening to the Jewish people in Germany and in Poland, I didn't think it was the greatest crime in the history of man. I thought the greatest crime in the history of man was the American peculiar system of slavery and its results. But I wanted to fight for the country. So I tried. I volunteered, took the test, passed it. They said no. So I did what any other young men were doing. I volunteered and went into the infantry as a private. Right. Now, this is from that. Now, incidentally, when I came back from overseas, I had to find 169 combat missions, arguing with people about everything that happened to us overseas, where the segregation in the military while we were in combat was as bad as it was in the States. Even worse sometimes, because we couldn't even go to an officers' club in Naples, Italy, where we were stationed. And the Italian civilians whom we had supposedly overcome treated us better, and not because they were more servile or because they were kissing up to us, but because they didn't have this idea that we were so bad or that we were inferior to everyone else. This was it. You should be happy that I did not keep my word to my son. I did Korea, and then when Vietnam came, I looked up one day and found out my son, Lee 3, was in Vietnam. I said, 22 years, I beat this kid on the head. He didn't learn a damn thing. He's in Vietnam. And not only that, he's in Vietnam without a gun. He's a medic. What to do? And discussing with my father, he said, well, you know, that's not the first time, buddy. He says, my father, which was my grandfather, he said he was in the Civil War and in the Spanish-American War. So it's a family trait that we defend our country, whether she's right or whether she's wrong. But it doesn't mean you have to accept what they're doing or what they're saying. There is a great book out written by a woman by the name of Gail Buckley. It's called The American Patriots. I spend all my time telling people to read books. That's because I was a professor for a number of years, and I realized that reading is one of the great sciences of the world. It's what does more for anyone than anything else. Gail Buckley wrote a book called The American Patriots. She had listened to us loudmouths for years tell her all the time about what we did and what they did, that the first man killed in the Revolutionary War was an African-American, yak, 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 yak. And Gail went and did the study. Now, what is it about Gail that makes it so particular? She's the daughter of Lena Horne. Lena Horne was the African-American military man's version of Betty Grable. And not only that, she could sing. Gail was selling her book, and she invited a fellow by the name of Roscoe Brown and I, who were in town that day, to come to her book signing and say a few words. We went, and we told them that it was a great book. I had already read it. And said it was a great book, it's a wonderful thing, and I think everybody should buy it. And some young man in the audience says, Colonel Archer, he said, did you really know Lena Horne? I said, yes, she traveled through all the bases, she did all the things. She was a wonder. And the guy says, was she really pretty? And I said, yes. So he said, how pretty? And I guess he was looking for a description, but I gave him what I thought was a better one. I said, well, I hit on her every day. And Gail has never invited me back to another one of her books. These are what we call anecdotal histories. We can tell you about firefights. We can tell you why Mr. Jefferson, who had been told by our intelligence officers that there was no flak where we were going that day. Another one of the lies they told us. We referred to weathermen and intelligence officers as groups of liars. And they were doing the best they could. They tried to protect us the best they can. But these are the kind of stories that we try to tell. When the session is over, if there's any questions in your mind about anything, about missions, about treatment, about discoveries, let you know. And my final thing I'd like to say is that I still have a young man by the name of Richard Blevins that I keep in touch with. He's from Detroit. He was my crew chief, a staff sergeant, younger than me by 2 years. I was 21. This remarkable young man was trained on the P-40, one airplane, and never got trained again. Yet he crewed a P-39, the next aircraft we got, the P-40, which P-47 rather, the Thunderbolt, which was a completely different engine. It was a revolutionary engine, not an inline, and the P-51. Now, if you think this is ridiculous, kids, and many like him, all these other crew chiefs, sat in the tents at night and read these books on how to maintain the airplane. And I personally did 169 missions and never had an early return. I brought back airplanes with holes in them and things like that, but never without an airplane. I was afraid to come back without it because he'd have killed me. But this, to tell you how this story ends is that at the gathering of eagles in Alabama, a fellow by the name of Yeager, name should be familiar to everybody, Chuck Yeager, very famous pilot, wonderful man. He came into the building one day and he had in his hand a sheet of papers and he threw it on front of me. He said, "Hey, Lee, look. Isn't it great to see that again?" And I turned it over and it was the manual for the P-51. And he said, "Isn't it great to see it again?" And I said, "No, I'm sorry, Charles." I said, "But I never saw it before in my life." And he said, "Did you fly the 51? I said, "Yes, over 100 missions." He said, "But this is the manual." I said, "Yes, but we never saw it." And that was the way things went in those days. Yet we came through. And this is my way of saluting all those young enlisted men, 21, 18, but all of those men who made it possible for people like myself and Jeff to do what we did. I'll be around after this is over. I'll answer your questions. And if you form the mob outside, I'll leave by the back door.
Thank you very much, Lee Archer. Lee Archer, Combat Ace. Thank you, Lee. And now we will ask Alex Jefferson to come forward and tell you a little bit about himself, and then we'll go ahead with questions, okay? Alex.
Thank you, thank you. 1136. Everybody's talked about the history of Tuskegee Airmen, all about the places and things and history, and I might as well jump in and talk about me. Number one, Lee said something about how he got into Tuskegee Airmen. Well, in Germany had jumped on Poland, war had started, and the War Department had sent down some recruiters through the black colleges. I was going to Clark College in Atlanta. And of course, I'd put together airplanes all my life, and I just wanted to fly an airplane. Opportunity came, and I sent back home and asked my old man, can I join the Army Air Corps? He said, hell no, finish Clark first. I finished, and of course, there was a thing called a draft. Today, young people, young men, young women, don't have to worry. You can say, hell no, I won't go. Beautiful, and we respect it. But you see, in 1941, there was a draft. And as a young black man, I would go to the heavy, nasty, filthy, dirty work, and the quartermaster. That's where they sent blacks. Squadron F in the Air Force. I qualified for Tuskegee Army Airfield. By the way, if you were drafted, you made $21 a month. Heavy, nasty, dirty work. As a cadet, I made $75 a month while training with the excitement of flying an airplane. Then after 9 months, I became a second lieutenant. Got your gold bar, wings, and all these pretty girls. Oh, $150 a month, plus $75 for flying. Now, which would you take? No sweat. Now, you talk about being young, full of pea and vinegar. Yeah, that's what us. We were raunchy, individualistic. Every Tuskegee Airman had a different personality. By the way, how many Smiths do we have? Raunchy Smith, ignorant Smith, dissipating Smith, lying Smith, fantastic Smith, dissipating Smith. See? We were a bunch of characters, but individualistic in all respects, but to each man, credibly, an individual. I might as well get into something else. We talked about history. I was shot down I had 18 1/2 missions. That half was we were strafing radar stations on the coast of southern France. First time we had a radar strafing mission. All the others were high level, escorting the B-17s and B-24s from Italy to Berlin, Italy to Ploesti, Italy to Poland, Italy to Greece, high level, where you sit up at 20, if the B-17s are at 23,000, our first squadron will be 24, the second squadron, 25, the third squadron, 26, the fourth squadron, 27. And by the way, the B-17s only made 160 miles an hour. I had a ride about last summer out here at the Yankee Air Museum in a B-17. First time I got close to that son of a gun. 160 miles an hour. Hell, at altitude, if we did 160, we'd stall out. So therefore, one squadron would be S-ing back and forth over B-17s like this, and the next squadron, and lo and behold, the top squadron, sometimes it pushed us up to 32,000 feet. And you talk about squeezy, real easy on controls. This mission, strafing radar stations, our squadron 301st had Toulon Harbor, and we didn't know what the hell radar was. 1944. Now you got to remember now, before ballpoint pens, before FM radio, radar, all this stuff, no television. And they said, well, what's radar? Well, there's some big towers over there, so you go over and shoot up the towers with your 50 calibers and destroy the towers and the building. 301st went over, and 4 flights of 4. First flight, second flight, third flight, fourth flight. I'm number 16. I'm number tailing Charlie. So the first 3 flights go in, radio says, hey man, look, the side of the cliff is little red spots. Oh, goddamn, they're shooting at you. Yeah. Oh, crap. I went across the top of the target. Well, Danny got hit, first of all. Danny's number 2. He got hit, we were about 2,000 yards. He got hit, and I saw the black smoke. He trailed off to the side. But I got to stay in formation. Go across the top of the target. I think I was about 50 feet, I don't know. Too damn close. And all of a sudden, something said, boom. Look up, and there's a hole in the top of the canopy. And fire came up out of the floor. So you had to pull up off the deck and get out the goddamn thing. So as you go up, you rack in forward trim tab. Forward trim tab. You turn the stick loose, the nose goes down. So I get up about halfway, you're going up, you pull a little red knob, and the canopy goes off. You get up about halfway, and you hit the old buckle. You have straps across here and straps. When you hit the old buckle, I'm up like this, and the nose popped, and I came out. I remember the tail going by with all the fire. And then you pull the D-ring, and you look at that son of a gun, you say, oh, God, they stole the silk. Because there was a rumor that somebody was taking the silk out of the parachutes, selling it to the Italians. By the time the darn thing, boom, I'm going down through the trees. So you hit and you roll over. They said if you go down in southern France, you get with the Free French, the French Marquis. They'll get you back home. Hell, I hit the ground and rolled over, and I looked up, and that son of a gun had a gun about that big around. Ach so, ja, Leutnant. God, okay. My introduction to Germany, the Luftwaffe, well, that was ground artillery. And let me go through this. The guy who was, the German who was the officer in charge of these characters, took me down to the French Riviera, well, right on the Riviera, right on the water. And he was sitting at a villa right on the water, on a porch with a glass table. And as these two guards, the German guards, pulled me in, I saw this crap on his shoulder, so quite naturally I saluted. And in perfect English, he said, "Lieutenant, have a seat." Now, how would you feel? He said, have you been to Atlanta? No. Name, rank, and what? Serial number. Being a soldier. Although I went to Clark College in Atlanta 4 years. He was explaining how he went to, he was a jazz fanatic. He knew all about the black nightclubs on Auburn Avenue. He talked about Washington, D.C. Ever been to Washington? No. He knew about the Howard Theater. I went to Howard University for a year. And he knew about the Howard Theater. He knew about the U Street, Crystal Caverns, everywhere there was black music. And I said, finally, he said, you ever been to Detroit? And by that time, I said, yes, yeah. Oh, he said, then you know how to go downtown Detroit and catch the Oakland streetcar behind the library. And then you go out Adams, East Adams, that was the valley, where he had the 3 Sixes and the Horseshoe Bar and the ladies who was the hotel across the street. He knew about. Turns out this character had graduated from the University of Michigan in 1936 and had gone back to Germany, and they put him in control of the local artillery. And he talked about jazz and his great times in the United States. He smoked my cigarettes because I was smoking Lucky Strike then. Ironically, everywhere we went, Red Cross lady was handing out free cigarettes. Isn't it ironic? They made smokers out of us. That's why the cancer rate among World War II veterans is so high. We grew up in a situation where our movie actresses, cigarettes. In a movie, when a guy was he's killed in action, he's lying there just about to go. What's the last thing he put in his mouth? Damn cigarette. Well, that's part of the story. They took me up to Frankfurt on the Main, interrogated there by the famous, I forget his name, some German interrogator, and he had a big book in front of him. He sat me down at the table, and right across there was a big book about so big and so wide, about that thick. And on I see around the cover it says 332nd Fighter Group, Negroes, Red Tails. He turned around, he thumbed through some pages. And I saw all the pictures of the previous classes, every class picture. And I saw all these class pictures, all these guys. See, because we know all the classes ahead of us. So I looked at him, and finally says, "Lieutenant, isn't that you? My class picture." There I'm standing on 44A, January 1944. He knew more about me than I knew about myself. Chadsey High School in Detroit, Condon Middle School, Clark College in Atlanta, had all my marks. Howard University had my marks in chemistry. I got a master's degree in organic chemistry, had all the marks. Even knew how much taxes my dad paid on his house in Detroit. Because we find out all of this is information that anybody can find out. You can go downtown and get it. Today, as I talk to young people, I said, they know everything about you. They said, oh, wow. Everybody here has a what? There you go, Social Security number. You even got your credit rating, everything about you. Shows the information that was even done in World War II. I wound up in Stalag Luft 3. Stalag means camp. Luft, L-U-F-T, means air. Number 3, controlled by the Luftwaffe, which was politically much more democratic than the Wehrmacht or the SS. Spent 5 months at Stalag Luft 3. Typically, if you saw the movie Great Escape, they went to that place to get the locale for the Great Escape, the barracks and the barbed wire and the whole shebang. 5 months at Stalag Luft 3, and then we were transferred to 7A, which is close to Munich. Oh, by the way, when I first got there, quite naturally, many of the guys who were there had never known that blacks were flying. Some of the guys had been there for 2.5 or 3 years. There were 5,000 American flying officers shot down over German-occupied territory. 5,000, Stalag Luft 3. And there was a little, I could feel, nobody said anything, don't get me wrong. Nobody said anything, but I could feel the negative feelings. 2 weeks later, a bomber crew came in from the 15th Air Force. And when they saw me, they ran and grabbed me and said, "Hey, buddy, you're one of these Red Tails." I said, "Yeah. If you guys had been with us, we wouldn't have been shot down." And it spread throughout the whole camp. "Hey, Jeff is a P-51 dude from Red Tail." Because in Italy, we had 4 P-51 groups. Checkerboard tails with a black and yellow squares, like a checkerboard, 325th. Solid yellow tail, the 52nd. Candy stripe, red and white stripe on a tail, it's the 31st. And the red tails, 332nd. And the 4 of us were escorting back and forth. I saw Dachau because I was not in Dachau. Patton's Third Army came through, and a couple of days later, we went down, we saw Dachau. I tell young people today, beware, man's inhumanity to man. We talk about ethnic cleansing, Bosnia, Rwanda, Congo, many, many things. Finished up life as a school teacher. Thought the one time I wanted to go into business. Thank God I didn't. Education to me was the greatest thing. I've enjoyed it. After 35 years, I said, hell no, I quit. Let me go, give me my money. I've had enough. Thank you much, folks. Thank you much.
Alexander Jefferson. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Well, it's sure been a pleasure chatting with you. We're going to cut the comments short so that we can listen to what questions you might have on your minds. Now, I know that these gentlemen are sitting down here comfortably, but I'm going to ask them to come and stand up here so that, you know, in the old military, you want a clear field of fire, so that you can get a clear field of fire at us as you fire your questions, and you can designate them for individuals, or you can just ask us as a group.
When you made the comment about the Dachau,
Yes,
the 761st Tank Squadron,
they're the ones,
the Liberators.
that's right.
At Buchenwald, I think it was. Buchenwald. Now, for those of you in here who are real scholars, like I claim to be, we handed out a bibliography on the Tuskegee Airmen as you walked in. I hope you all got a copy of it. In 1979, here on this campus, we also made a videotape entitled Buffalo Soldiers. It was a part of a National Endowment for the Humanities grant, where I interviewed Robert Claire Chandler, a fighter pilot who was shot down from Allegan, Michigan, who was missing behind the lines in Yugoslavia. Now,
Come up closer, come up closer.
T?
Come up.
Tony,
Tony,
What's going on here?
I want you to come closer.
we bonded.
I'm a fighter pilot.
We got him. Here's my dignitary, Tuskegee alumnus, Helen Truss. I think we have time for about 4 questions because Tony has to get the airmen over to Battle Creek on a luncheon. Thanks to the Kellogg Foundation, we have our aviation engineering department and the wise people at this university. If there are any questions, feel free to fire them. This gentleman here has been trying to ask a question.
I got one question of this gentleman. You have to pack your own shoe?
Oh, no. Oh,
You
no.
didn't pack your own?
We had a group, we had people doing, packing shoes for us. Mechanics, we had our own mechanics. I didn't know a darn thing about that airplane. I didn't know anything about the parachute or radios.
No, we never even got a tech order.
No.
If you pull that thing and it didn't go, what'd you do?
Well, we take it back and get another one.
Bob Hope, gentlemen? You never know.
We met Bob Hope when he came to speak to us in our second convention in California. He was coming down the elevator, he saw us and said, "Hey, fellas," he says, "what are you doing here?" In those days, some of us were still on active duty. We still wore our uniforms. And he came to the party that night and said, "Hey, can I speak?" And that was the first time we saw him.
You got to realize that we had 2 separate armies at that time. This was when I showed the double V fighting.
Okay.
Not only did you have 2 armies, you had 2 USOs. You had a black USO and a white USO. We're talking about the military being. It was unusual. I'm a career Army brat. My father was a career Army officer. I was an incorrigible child, my mother said. So every military installation in the South during the summer, I stayed there. And my father used to tell me about these stories. 2 USOs, 2 armies, because of the entrenched racism, as Dr. Latensky said, it's strange that a Southerner by the name of Harry Truman led to the desegregation of the military. Gentlemen in the back. We have time for about 3 more questions because I got to get, these guys look awesome, don't they? They are 80. That's it.
I'd like to take just a minute instead of asking a question. I was born in 1940, so didn't know a lot about the war, but I read a lot afterwards. During the 40s, as far as black Americans, it was Joe Louis that I knew quite a bit about because of his activities. After that, Jackie Robinson came into the picture, I think in 1947,
Yes.
into the major league. And during the 50s and even the 60s, I wasn't necessarily hoodwinked, but there wasn't a lot about you fellas. Until recent years on History Channel, I've watched it all. I've read and heard everything, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here because I think you fellas were more instrumental in doing for your own race and also fighting for America than what the Joe Louis and Jackie Robinson did. And I want to thank all of you, and God bless you.
And then you, Dr. Phillips. Yes, sir.
First, I want to say my grandfather, when he went to join for the Spanish-American War, was denied the opportunity to join. He used an epithet and told him to go home. I also, Dwayne Roberts was my assistant scout troop leader down at the old Douglas. And he did have, you indicated he was a support. He had a vast collection of photos of the airmen, which fascinated the scout troop. I hope you've got them into the Westerns collection by now, or get them. I have a February 1945 crisis, which some of us older ones know was the NAACP's magazine. This is a cover, and it has the airmen of New York, and I think one of you, Mr. Archer, might be on here. I'd like to show it to you and see if we can get your autograph. But it says 7 New York Bombardiers.
Yes.
Was that you?
Yes.
We thought we identified it.
That was me.
I'd like to get your autograph for it.
It was one of my bad years.
You look good, you and that.
Okay. All right. Before Dr. Phillips first. Now, if you are really interested in the black military experience, I'm talking specifically to my students. Get your piece of paper. I've got some sources where I can drop on you. One piece by Benjamin Quarles. It's the Negro in the Civil War. There's also a piece by a guy named Joseph T. Wilson called The Black Phalanx, the Civil War. Sable Arms by Samuel Cornish. Emmett Scott wrote a piece on the history of the Negro during the First World War. And Wallace Terry, a piece called The Black Military Experience in Vietnam. But do realize that African Americans have been fighting for this country, in some cases against this country, during the war for independence that some people mislabeled the American Revolutionary War, because it certainly wasn't a revolution for the Africans who were still enslaved. You should do some research on the soldiers of King George. These are the African Americans who fought for the British in exchange for a promise of freedom, who eventually ended up in Nova Scotia and eventually to Sierra Leone. So if you're needing the sources on the military, I suggest you check with our military science department on campus, but I don't think you know this because it's a part of the conspiracy of silence, called 72667. That's Africana Studies, where your boy is, me. All right.
So copy on his point about the conspiracy of silence. A gentleman by the name of Gordon Parks, a very famous writer and everything else, got in touch with me in 1972. And he wanted to do a movie about the Tuskegee Airmen before the television movie. And he had people ready to do it and all. And he took us to Hollywood. I'm naming names now, so let him sue. And he took us to Hollywood, Roscoe Brown and I, and a fellow by the name of Charles Dryden, and said, I want to do a movie about these guys, and a factual movie, just tell their story. And the person out there, Jack Haley Jr., the son of the great actor Jack Haley, he was the head of Universal Studios, and he said, fine, make a pitch. And so Gordon Parks, who has no reason to have doubtful credentials, made the pitch for us, and we all sat there. Well, Roscoe and I, Dryden didn't make it, but we made the pitch out there for him and everything else, and when it's finished, he gave it to someone else to write the script, and he wrote a script of 30-some-odd pages and sent it to us to look at. And I wrote 31 pages of objections. Roscoe wrote some also, but I remember that. So we went out to explain why we were objecting, and he made a couple of cracks. And he's not a racist, he's just a Hollywood type. And he says, well, you have all these things. And he said, you got them down around looking like heroes. And Gordon Parks says, yes. He said, that's how they look. He's a photographer, and he actually made us. I have a picture he made of me. I look like a hero. But anyhow, when the thing was over, I said, why don't you make the picture? And the guy says to us, Mr. Haley, he says, well, white people don't want to see African Americans, or colored, he used the word, as heroes. And that was the end of the damn conversation. I got up, I walked out, he thought I was going to the toilet. I went and got on my taxi, went to the airport, got an airplane, came home. And that's what this conspiracy of silence is all about sometimes. It's not that they don't intend to. Howard Brokaw, Tom Brokaw, awarded me the Franklin D. Roosevelt Medal based on the 4 freedoms, just last year. And it's a nice medal, it's gold, and I accepted it on behalf of the Tuskegee Airmen. And I'm going to keep it. I'm not going to give it to the Tuskegee Airmen. It's solid gold. And they all know it. But anyhow, he pins this medal around my neck, and he's saying, what a wonderful person. And I said, well, Mr. Brokaw, how come when you wrote your book, just published a couple of months ago, that there's only 1 paragraph in there about African American pilots? And he's talking about pilots all through the damn book. 300 and some odd pages, 1 paragraph. And he says, well, it never just came up. Now, here's a great reporter, I'll give him that, a great writer, his book sold 1 million copies, and he didn't think it was important enough to even mention our group. Silence.
But that's all right, even though he didn't. Phil Hart, a graduate of Michigan State, wrote a piece on black pilots, going all the way from Eugene Ballard all the way to the astronauts. And of course, this piece by Von Hardesty, Black Wings. In addition to it, another piece that was recently published dealt with the notorious incident that took place at Centerville, Mississippi, where 1,200 African-American infantrymen were shot dead. They were from the north, they went to the south with northern attitudes, so the people of Centerville, Mississippi claimed. And one night while digging trenches, 1,200 were machine gunned. Sir, the last question, because Tony has to get them to Battle Creek. Sorry, sir. Right here.
Sir, I'd like to give you greetings, first of all, from the Royal Air Force to retired officers here.
Well.
Secondly, I'd like to ask you about the change. I appreciate you've got limited time available to you, and particularly as you've got young people here who are currently serving in the country. The changes that have taken place. Is the U.S. military truly desegregated?
The military in the United States is probably the only and the best example ever of integration. And it's done because you were told, this is what we're going to do by Harry Truman. I'm the damn president, and if you don't go along with it, you're out of business. You can leave the service. It has worked. As badly as it worked, it has probably been the most successful idea of the treatment of people as equals over the set. I remember the time when a person like myself could look at the military, and the only thing they could see with a star on their shoulder was Theus, Ben Davis, Chappie James. Colonels, there were 5. The most numerous grade out of the Tuskegee Airmen is Lieutenant Colonel, retirees.
Yes.
Got up to there, stopped. I left the service because I didn't make a bird colonel.
That's right. Me
It
too.
was the best thing ever happened to me, but I did do it anyhow. That was it. I think it was 8 years ago, I went to a meeting down in Washington, and I came in late when Cone was Secretary of Defense. And I walked into the room and looked down into the ballroom, and down there, stars all over the place. Not only on white soldiers and military, but on black ones. Eagles, not only on African Americans and women, but women all over the place. In fact, one of the young ladies there is a very dear friend of mine. who has risen in 20 years to be a bird colonel and is going on. So they have had some great successes. My job, I say it, is different than some other people's. What am I giving this to? What I work for, how I worked hard for it. I gave it to people who I consider younger than me. I'm 81, damn it. So anybody under 80, as far as I'm concerned, is a youngster. That's it. Okay, you youngsters, 40, 50, 60 years of age, you watch who you give it to.
That's right.
And make sure that they carry on this battle, because we'll be fighting this war forever unless, it's never going to be a win unless we stay on guard. And I'm not talking about the war in Iraq or Kuwait, I'm talking about the war for equal rights.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know that I speak for all of the Tuskegee Airmen who are here with you this morning when I say that we greatly appreciate the opportunity to be with you. It has been an honor and a privilege, and we hope that we have been able to get across our message simply that we were able to overcome by pursuing excellence and pass on to the youngsters that they too can succeed if they pursue excellence. God bless all of you, and God bless America.